January 1st, 2023, 7 in the morning, Ciudad Juarez. While most of the city was still asleep, a convoy of armored vehicles rolled toward the gates of the Cerezo 3 prison. Within seconds, the sound of automatic gunfire shattered the calm of the morning. The guards went down before they could reach their radios. Inside the cell blocks, fires began to break out, the air filled with smoke, screams, and the roar of rifle rounds echoing against the concrete. The shooting began in perfect sync. The bursts coming from outside the walls matched an uprising from within. The attackers moved with a clear purpose. Their targets had been chosen in advance. The coordination was exact. In less than 10 minutes, more than 30 inmates managed to escape into the streets. Among them was the most feared man in the entire prison, Ernesto Alfredo Piñón de la Cruz. To the public, he was known as El Neto. To the men who worked for him, he was untouchable. For more than a decade, he had turned a high-security prison into the headquarters of Los Mexicles. From there, he ran drug trafficking routes, ordered killings, and bribed the very guards who were supposed to keep him under control. From his cell, he ruled with absolute authority, until that morning when the wall stopped holding him. 4 days later, the manhunt would end with a crash, a shootout, and a body lying in the back of a government vehicle. This is the story of how El Neto built an empire from inside a cell, and of how it all came apart during a week of extreme violence. Cerezo 3 sat on the outskirts of Ciudad Juarez, a short distance from the border with the United States. In theory, it was a high-security state prison designed to hold some of the most dangerous criminals in Mexico. In practice, it operated like a fortress. The guards wore the uniforms, but the real authority was in the hands of the gangs operating inside the prison. Over time, control of the facility passed completely to the inmate leaders, and Los Mexicles ended up dominating every one of the blocks. For the right price, anything could get in. Weapons, drugs, cell phones, and even furniture and appliances passed through the gates without meeting any resistance. The guards took the bribes or simply avoided any kind of confrontation. By 2022, some sections of the facility no longer even looked like prison areas. There were cells with jacuzzis, oversized TVs, sound systems, fully stocked bars, and safes full of cash. This wasn't contraband carefully hidden to avoid being discovered. It was all openly part of daily life inside the Cerezo. And at the center of it all was Ernesto Alfredo Piñón de la Cruz, known as El Neto. His authority stretched across every wing of the prison, and his decisions determined the way the facility ran. Ernesto Alfredo Piñón de la Cruz was born in the early 1990s in northern Mexico. The city where he grew up had already become a battlefield between rival cartels, and the streets seemed to offer only two paths: become a victim of the violence or become part of it. By the time he reached his late teens, El Neto had already picked his side. His name was linked to kidnappings, armed robberies, and planned executions in different parts of the state of Chihuahua. He found his place within Los Mexicles, a street gang based in Ciudad Juarez that maintained deep ties to the Juarez cartel. Ambitious, calculating, and ruthless, he rose quickly through their ranks. His reputation was built on his precision. In 2009, when he was just 18 years old, his criminal career hit its first major obstacle. Police linked him to multiple kidnappings and murders. He was captured, brought to trial, and handed a sentence that, in theory, was supposed to keep him locked up for the rest of his life: 224 years in prison. For most people, that would have been the end. For El Neto, it only meant a change of direction. From inside Cerezo 3, he adapted immediately. He rebuilt his network using visits, bribed guards, and smuggled in cell phones to stay connected to the outside world. Before long, his orders were being carried out hundreds of miles from the prison walls. Drug shipments moved under his command. Extortion networks brought him cash every week. His enemies, both inside and outside the prison, were eliminated without him ever having to leave his cell. Over time, the prison became far more than his base of operations. It became his territory. By 2022, El Neto was no longer just another inmate. He was the most powerful man in Cerezo 3 and one of the most feared people in Ciudad Juarez. But in August 2022, the state government authorized a high-security transfer. Ernesto Alfredo Piñón de la Cruz would be removed from Cerezo 3 and sent to a federal maximum security prison far from Ciudad Juarez. The goal was obvious: pull him out of his base of operations and strip away the control he had built inside those walls. News of the decision didn't stay within official channels for long. Inside the prison, the messages spread fast. By the time the afternoon arrived, El Neto already knew every detail: the route, the schedule, and the real intent behind the operation. That day, Ciudad Juarez exploded. A grocery store became the first scene of the violence. 2 armed men walked in, opened fire on the customers, and left without taking a single peso. Minutes later, flames consumed a convenience store on the other side of the city. In less than an hour, several vehicles were burning in the streets and blocking intersections. A bus was stopped. The attackers forced the passengers off and then set the vehicle on fire in the middle of the street. The targets didn't appear to be coordinated, but the purpose was stores, restaurants, street vendors, anyone, anywhere could become a target. By late afternoon, a well-known radio host walked out of the station where he worked and dropped to the ground before he could reach his car. Witnesses said they never managed to see the shooter. In another neighborhood, a mechanic who had just finished his shift was killed outside his shop. By the time night fell, 11 people were dead. Most of them had no connection whatsoever to organized crime. The state government canceled the transfer the following morning. The decision was never explained. Officials avoided answering questions. Inside Cerezo 3, the message had been sent and received. Being locked in a cell had done absolutely nothing to weaken El Neto's reach. The smoke from what came to be called Black Thursday hung over Ciudad Juarez for several days. The streets grew quieter. Stores began closing earlier. The city moved cautiously, aware that the violence could return at any moment. Inside Cerezo 3, the reaction was very different. El Neto had forced the state to back down. The transfer had been canceled. He was still in control. But the events of August had also shown something else. The government was willing to move against him. And that would not be forgotten. From that moment on, his strategy changed. Instead of retaliating immediately, he began to prepare. The plan was not thrown together in a hurry. It was built little by little, in fragments. A conversation during yard time. A coded message smuggled out through a visitor. Instructions passed between trusted men while they worked in the laundry area. The weapons were brought in gradually. Some arrived hidden inside supply trucks. Others were brought in as smaller pieces and later assembled on the inside. The ammunition was stored in places where the guards rarely checked, or where they had been paid not to check at all. The right people were approached. A guard who needed money to help a sick relative, another who had already looked the other way on some minor favors before. Some took the money, others gave in to threats. Either way, they all agreed to do their part. By October, the main structure of the plan was already in place. 2 groups positioned on the outside would coordinate with the inmates inside the prison. The external teams would arrive heavily armed and travel in armored vehicles. Their job would be to draw the fire and overwhelm the defenses at the entrance. Meanwhile, the internal teams would create chaos. They would start fires, free the selected prisoners, and break up the formation in the yard to clear the way. The escape would not depend on force alone, it would depend on timing. They had to choose a day when security was at its weakest, when there were few guards, and the staff's attention was divided. New Year's Day fit perfectly. Most of the city would be asleep after the previous night's celebrations. Many officers would be distracted or absent. The morning routines would be slower and the checks less strict. Through November and December, the remaining pieces kept falling into place. The prison routines were studied. The schedules were memorized. The escape routes out of the facility were calculated minute by minute. On the outside, the vehicles were reinforced, the weapons were tested, and the plan of attack was rehearsed inside safe houses. By the last week of the year, everyone involved knew their roles by heart. Who would fire the first shots? Who would open the gates? Who would cover the escape? And most importantly, who would make sure Ernesto Alfredo Piñón de la Cruz disappeared into the city? When the morning of January 1st arrived, everything was ready. The plan had been set. The roles were assigned. The orders were clear: move fast, hit hard, and make sure no one could stop them. The sun was just beginning to cut through the cold morning mist over Ciudad Juarez. Most of the city was still asleep. The remnants of the previous night's fireworks were still scattered across the streets. though the smoke had already cleared. At the Cereso, the day began quietly. The main gate was operating, but the pace of activity was slow. The guards were carrying out the shift change. Some were talking about the previous night's celebrations. Several inmates lingered near the yard. Nothing in their movements warned of what was about to happen. Then, at 7 in the morning, a convoy appeared on the road. 3 armored vehicles moved in formation and slowed as they approached the prison. They had no lights on. There were no sirens. There was only the steady sound of the engines drawing closer. The vehicle stopped in front of the entrance. An instant later, the silence broke. The gunfire began in controlled bursts. The first rounds tore through the guard posts and cut down the guards inside before they could react. Others tried to get to safety, but they were hit while they were still exposed. Inside, the signal had already been given. The inmates abandoned their morning routine. Some ran toward the smoke with weapons in their hands. Others began setting fires. The mattresses and trash ignited instantly, filling the corridors with thick clouds of black smoke. The attack advanced from 2 directions at the same time. Outside, the gunmen pressed forward, firing short, precise bursts, forcing the remaining guards to stay pinned down. Inside, the cell doors were opened one after another, releasing the men who had been selected to escape. The noise was constant, the crack of the rifles, the screams coming from the yard, and the roar of the flames as the fires spread. Visibility dropped to just a few meters. The shadows moved quickly through the smoke and were impossible to identify until they were already too close. Within minutes, the first group of inmates reached the breached entrance. Some ran straight for the vehicles waiting for them. Others disappeared down the side streets and scattered before reinforcements could arrive. In the middle of the chaos, one figure stayed near the center of the movement, flanked by gunmen who never left his side. It was Neto. By the time the gunfire began to die down, the damage was already irreversible. 10 guards had been killed. 7 inmates lay where they had fallen. More than 24 prisoners had managed to get out. Neto had vanished. A few hours after the escape, the Mexican Army and the National Guard surrounded Cereso 3. Armored vehicles blocked every road leading to the prison. When the security forces entered the facility, the battle was already over. The attackers had disappeared. The surviving guards were in a state of shock. Some were wounded. Others stayed silent as they took in the destruction around them. But what the soldiers found inside was far more than the aftermath of an attack. It was proof that Cereso 3 had been lost long before that morning. In one cell, they found a safe stuffed with bundles of bills, 1.7 million pesos in cash. In another, there was a flat-screen TV set against the wall next to a jacuzzi that was still full of water. There were weapons everywhere. Pistols, rifles, and boxes of ammunition sat within reach of the inmates' beds. In the rooms, 84 cell phones were recovered. Methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and fentanyl were pulled from stashes that had clearly been in use for months, maybe even longer. Some sections of the prison didn't even look like areas meant for inmates. They looked like private apartments with fully equipped kitchens, expensive furniture, and decorative lighting. In certain blocks, the soldiers found doors that led to restricted areas the prisoners never should have had access to. It became clear that the New Year's Day attack had not forced the doors open. Those doors had been open for years, not physically, but through the deals, the bribes, and the fear. The prison director was removed before the day was over. Investigations against dozens of guards began immediately. A total of 191 high-risk inmates were loaded onto buses and transferred to federal prisons in different parts of the country. And yet, even with soldiers controlling the facility, the scale of what had been uncovered carried a much deeper message. This had not been just a security failure. It was a system that had been handed over from the inside, and now, the man who had ruled it was somewhere out in the streets, protected by an armed network that had already shown it could strike without warning. By the afternoon of January 1st, the escape was already national news. Images of the 3 armored vehicles parked outside the Cereso played over and over on television screens. The number of fugitives changed with every official report. First it was 25, then 27, later about 30, but one name stayed constant: Ernesto Alfredo Piñón de la Cruz. Within hours, 200 soldiers were deployed across Ciudad Juarez. Federal police and National Guard units spread out along the highways, set up checkpoints, and began searching the rural roads leading toward the border. The United States temporarily closed its ports of entry at the crossings between Ciudad Juarez and El Paso to inspect every vehicle. The airports were quietly placed on alert. Rewards were announced as well. They offered 300,000 pesos for information related to the lower priority fugitives and 5 million pesos for any tip that led to El Neto. For the first 2 days, the search was methodical. Agents raided safe houses, questioned people suspected of helping the fugitives, and tracked down vehicles abandoned near the edges of the city. Then, on January 3rd, the manhunt turned bloody. A group of state investigators following different leads in the southern part of the city drove straight into an ambush. Bursts of automatic gunfire tore through their vehicles. 2 agents died instantly. The rest returned fire. By the time reinforcements arrived, 5 attackers lay dead in the street. The message was impossible to ignore. Los Mexicles were willing to fight for him in broad daylight. Ciudad Juarez began to feel the pressure. The schools closed. Businesses pulled down their shutters before noon. The streets emptied after dark. The city waited for the next move, not knowing whether it would come from the authorities or from El Neto's men. 2 days passed in a tense silence. Then, before dawn on January 5th, federal intelligence units received a location. It was a house in the Aztecas neighborhood, one of the most dangerous areas in Ciudad Juarez. The source claimed that Ernesto Alfredo Piñón de la Cruz was inside. The agents moved quickly. Unmarked vehicles rolled forward with their lights off and their engines at low revs, stopping just short of the block. The armed teams deployed and surrounded the property from every angle. For several minutes, nothing moved. Then a figure appeared in the front doorway. El Neto came out wearing a bulletproof vest and holding a pistol in his hand. He ran straight for a black armored car parked by the curb. The engine roared as the vehicle took off. The tires kicked gravel into the darkness, and the convoy gave chase. The pursuit tore through the empty streets, the sound of the engines echoing between the concrete walls. With every turn, the agents closed in. The distance shrank with every block. 2 minutes later, the car slammed into the side of a gas station. The impact crushed the front end and threw a cloud of debris across the pavement. El Neto came out of the vehicle firing before his feet even touched the ground. The bullets shattered windows and threw sparks as they struck metal. The agents returned fire as they closed in from both sides. Several rounds hit El Neto. He staggered, but kept moving and kept squeezing the trigger until his weapon was empty. The agents rushed him, took him down, and tore the pistol from his hand. He was placed in the back of a government vehicle as he lost a large amount of blood. Minutes later, as he was being taken to the hospital, he stopped breathing. The man who had ruled Cerezo III for more than a decade was dead. News of El Neto's death spread across Ciudad Juarez before dawn. Hours after the announcement, gunmen linked to Los Mexicles set fire to 2 convenience stores and opened fire on the offices of the state attorney general's office, the same institution that had confirmed his death. The attacks offered no tactical advantage. They were a response, a reminder that his influence had not vanished overnight. Over the following days, the authorities tried to close every possible crack in the prison system. The 191 high-risk inmates from Cerezo III were transferred to federal facilities. The prison director was removed. Dozens of guards began to be investigated for having allowed contraband, luxuries, and unrestricted movement inside the facility for years. Officials promised to implement reforms. There would be no more special treatment for cartel leaders. High-risk inmates would be moved immediately to isolated maximum security prisons. There would be stricter searches and tighter control over the staff. For the families of the 10 guards killed during the escape and of the civilians who died during Black Thursday, the pain was still raw. The public outrage did not fade quickly. Many people in Ciudad Juarez kept asking themselves the same question. How could something like this happen twice in the same year? Ernesto Alfredo Piñón de la Cruz was dead, but the network he built kept on existing. Los Mexicles were still operating in the city. They still controlled territory, and they still had men inside the prisons all across the state. But one question remained. If a single man could run an empire from inside a cell, how many more are doing exactly the same thing right now?